In this final video, I want to share a few more thoughts about my experience overall at working in a jail, doing ministry in jail, and also some of the things I've learned maybe about myself and other questions that have come to my mind just based on the experience that are apart from the actual experiences of working with the inmates one-on-one. I guess something that really struck me about this whole experience, and I alluded to this in the first video when I talked about the setting, how the jail setting itself tends to either reduce or concentrate the experience there. That is, I've noticed that the patterns that one sees, the spiritual patterns that one sees on the inside of a jail, desperation, hope, anger, trust, faith, brokenness, relationship, all these sort of core human themes are really brought to the fore on the inside of the institution. And it sort of serves as perhaps a microcosm to what goes on the outside. And by seeing those patterns more distinctly or thrown in such stark contrast, it's allowed me to see those very same patterns more clearly sort of on life on the outside. So that's one thing that I've learned. I guess the other thing that comes to mind, and this is something that I thought was going to be more of an issue or a problem going in, that kind of turns out not to be, but it's still something that comes to my mind, especially when I think of some of my political leanings and thinking about government and faith, and that is just how strange it is that we have an institution that's run by a provincial government, and within that institution that's government run, there are ministers and pastors and imams and other faith workers that I guess on some level the government sees value in having them there. Now, that's a whole issue unto itself, and going in, it did, I was a little bit, I wouldn't say worried, but just sort of on guard a little bit that I've got certain things that I hold to be true, certain things that I'm not willing to compromise, and I know like the government is not a church, and a jail is certainly not a church. So just being kind of aware of, am I going to be asked to compromise my faith in doing this kind of work? So on the one hand, I want to be true to the work or true to the faith that I'm doing, but also recognizing that the work I'm called to do is to minister to, everyone's spiritual needs, irrespective of their faith tradition or whether or not they even have a religion, that I can't withhold that service to anyone. Now, to my pleasant surprise, that did not, or hasn't so far been an issue. So I think I was maybe a little more sensitive than I needed to be about that thing. It reminds me a little bit about doing foster care. My wife and I did foster care for a little over 10 years, and we happened to do foster care with an agency that, without getting too much into this was a private agency that was subcontracted by the provincial government to provide foster homes and training for foster parents, etc. So I can't remember what they're called. There's a name for it. There's a number of these organizations that are, sounds kind of crass, but are subcontractors, for lack of a better word. And the one that we happened to work for happened to be a Christian organization. That is, that their general ethos was, resonant with Christianity, and but I don't think it was a requirement, but most of the families that were part of this particular organization happened to be Christians of varying traditions, of varying levels of commitment, I suppose. Some were maybe more nominal Christians, some were their faith played a bigger role in their own lives. But anyway, it reminded me of doing that because on the one hand you have the provincial government that's charged with looking after children who can't be with their parents for whatever reason, and here we have this Christian organization with volunteers and staff that are mostly Christian, and just sort of that sort of tension about those two things coming together. And I remember talking to one worker, this was someone who actually worked for the Ontario government, and she was telling me, I don't believe she was a Christian exactly the way she sort of related the story, but she said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that it's, I don't think she said open secret, but the workers themselves recognize that on the one hand they have to be government and can't show any favoritism to any particular faith or faith tradition, yet it was undeniable from her point of view that the vast majority of families that do foster care happen to either be Christians or be part of a culture where Christianity is perhaps more at the fore compared to other cultures. So it's that strange tension. And I think in the jail there was a little bit of that too. Although I'm surprised that, maybe not surprised, but questions of doctrine, of different traditions, of denominations, that, as best I can tell, has never come up, and it seems far from coming up. And even the boundaries between the different faith traditions, as the inmates in some cases understand them, can be a little bit blurry. And this is, I guess, not sure what the right verb here is. Expanded, broadened my own views, I suppose, on some level. Now there's a bit of tension here, because on the one hand, I don't know that my actual theology as such has changed, the things that I believe are true about God, and this is a process of uncovering things. I don't think those have shifted, but I think what I've learned is someone can be far away in terms of their theology or their worldview, far away from me where I personally happen to stand, and that does not have to be a barrier to me finding a connection with them. And that's something that really, we don't really talk about doctrine, and we don't debate these sorts of things in jail. That things tend to be a little bit more fundamental, as I alluded to, I think, in my earlier video. We tend to focus on broader topics like being created in the image of God, that there is even a God or a something, some creator, something that's beyond us that maybe we're to align ourselves with. And again, I was maybe concerned that I'd be forced to, maybe not forced, but coerced to compromise my own views, but that hasn't been the case. And I think there's something that might be transferable to life on the outside, especially as Christians relate to one another. I've noticed there's two, I'm not sure if it's quite fair to call them poles, but sort of opposing views when it comes to this kind of thing. And I'm going to caricature them a little bit here just to sort of make the point. But on the one side, there's this view that certain Christians hold and certain traditions hold, where they have these propositions, these things about God, about the church, about the Bible, that you need to kind of sign off on, do you agree to this list of statements? And if so, then we can have a talk, or then you can be part of our tribe and we can go from there. Again, it's a caricature, but there's sort of that leaning where you have to kind of get your theology right to even sort of get in the door, so to speak. And on the other side, there's a tendency where it's more, I guess, universal in nature, where, there's many paths to God, and whatever God means to you is fine. And if I take a specific, strong stand in terms of doctrine, that might be an impediment to you, so therefore I shouldn't articulate my own views very forcefully, all in the name of unity. And again, I'm caricaturing that side a little bit as well. And I think what I've learned is those two things don't need to be opposed. I don't need to necessarily change my own theological views in order to find something that I might have in common with you and what you believe, and that we could have a discussion and start there. Not necessarily to win you over. I'm not trying to win people over to my theology exactly. I'm trying to ultimately point people toward God, to make disciples. Now, my own theology is my own model, I guess, for lack of a better word, is how I understand all that to work. And it's something that I update and have updated over the years. And as I think about things, I sort of fill in parts. And there's still vast parts of my theology where I really don't know what I believe exactly. But I'm learning that it's not important that I win someone over to my way of thinking, but encourage them to, seek truth. Jesus himself talks about whoever seeks will find. And, I believe that the person of Jesus is that articulation of truth. And so even if someone doesn't go looking for Jesus, if they go looking for truth, that there's a good chance they will find him along the way, or as they get to that ultimate reality. It sort of made me think, like, by analogy, I think in the church and Christian circles, we sometimes get caught up on specific positions and don't think as much about directions that we're heading. And just to use kind of an absurd analogy, if you imagine that you're in Kingston, Ontario, and somehow your ultimate goal, whether you know it or not, your ultimate goal is Windsor, Ontario. And this is before GPS, before cell phones. You get yourself lost and you see a sign and it tells you that let's say you're near Belleville, which for those of you who don't know is well east of Toronto. So you're in and around Belleville and you see a sign that tells you you are heading toward Toronto. And you call someone up, you stop at a payphone, let's say, says, well, I'm near Belleville and the sign says I'm heading to Toronto. Am I going the right way? And based on that, it's like, yes, like heading toward Toronto is a good, like you're on the right path to ultimately get to Windsor. Now, of course, if the particulars were changed, if someone was near London, Ontario, and they got turned around and they realized, oh, we are heading toward Toronto, and you were to call someone, and ultimately the ultimate goal is to get to Windsor, from London heading toward Toronto is the wrong way to go. So the same intermediate goal, Toronto in this case, can, depending on where you are, could be a good direction to go or the wrong direction. And I think by analogy, like, encouraging people to understand God and their place in God's story, we need to kind of start where they are and encourage them to walk or to move in the direction toward God. So to use another example, maybe one that's more concrete, if you suppose there's an atheist out there and he doesn't think God is real, he doesn't think there's a historical Jesus. He acknowledges that there is this thing we call the Old Testament and it has sayings and teachings in it, but he thinks that maybe they're just made up stories that people have made up over the centuries. And that's where he is. And let's suppose, though, that he's open, that maybe there's something to these teachings. There's something to be gained or some benefit to be had by following some of them or all of them or trying to live them out. And as someone who's trying to make disciples, and if I'm talking to a person like that, I think it would be wise to encourage, at least that. Let's suppose he doesn't want to hear anything about Jesus, like about him being the Son of God or God incarnate. He doesn't want to hear any of that, but he is at least open to the possibility that these teachings have something to say. Well, I think compared to being like an atheist following your own sense of what's right and wrong, to take these teachings and try to align your life to those things would be to the good, would move someone closer to the kingdom of God. However, if there is someone who was, a devout Christian and they're thinking and they come to you for counsel and they say, you know what, I don't know about the resurrection, I don't know about whether church is important or even if all of the Bible's important, I think I'm just going to act as though Jesus was just a good moral teacher and I'm just going to do my best to kind of follow his teachings. I think it would be prudent to discourage someone from taking that view, that they're actually moving away from God in that sense, because they're taking something that is more and making it less. So using the moral teachings of Jesus as an intermediate target, depending on where you are, that might actually be a good target to move toward. But if you're already past that target, then you should set a better target to follow. So bringing this all back to jail, there's a lot of people that have different views about God. Many of the people in jail have very, basic sort of concepts. They talk about, well, I kind of went to church as a kid, or someone once sort of told me, and they've seen things on TV. So there's something attractive that they find attractive about faith in general, Christianity in particular, but they don't necessarily have a fulsome understanding of what it is. And I find that it's not so much my job to explain all that to them, but to sort of figure out where they are and then encourage them to take whatever the appropriate next step is toward, growing in faith as they kind of understand it where they are. So starting where you are and moving a bit closer, and then, repeating that over time. So I think that's something that the church overall can maybe do a better job at, is starting where people are and not necessarily being satisfied with where they are forever. I don't think we should ever be satisfied. We should constantly be growing, constantly be seeking, constantly be trying to, understand the nature of God better. I mean, I think theology is important. I think we should study it. I think we should debate it and discuss it and try to sharpen our minds to come up with a better model of trying to understand how God works and what his ways are and what his mission on earth is for us and how we should act. These are all things we should strive to get better at, knowing full well that we can never achieve them completely. And that's something that I think sort of one particular side gets wrong, and that's this idea that unless we have right theology, we can't even begin to walk with God. And I'm really thankful that God didn't wait for me to have anything near good theology before he started working in my life. When I look back at some of the kooky things that I kind of believed early in my walk, I kind of shudder, but that didn't turn God off. That was something that he used where I was at the time. He didn't say he was satisfied with me staying there. He wants me to grow. And I think he wants all of us to grow. So we can, theology is important, but sometimes we mix up the order, that we don't need to figure our theology out before we get started. We can begin our walk with God and work out our theology as we go. This concludes my video series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got questions, comments, I'd love to hear them. There's a lot of ideas in here. I know this is very different than what I've done in the past. I know theology, Christianity, etc. is not everyone's cup of tea, but if you're interested in talking about it, I'm interested in certainly having that discussion and engaging with the comments and perhaps making more videos based on what you guys have to say. Again, thanks for watching.